Doug Ford didn't hold back. On live television, he looked straight into the camera and said what few world leaders have dared to. Donald Trump is probably the most disliked politician in the world. That one sentence sent shockwaves through both sides of the border, not just because it was bold, but because it came from Canada's own premier, a politician who had once treaded carefully around U.S. relations. But something's changed. Ford isn't playing nice anymore. From economic threats to personal jabs, the gloves are off, and Trump's name is right in the CROSS HAIRS. So what made Ford snap? Why is he accusing Trump of betrayal? And how did this quiet tension between allies explode into a full-blown political feud that could reshape North American trade? The answers are deeper and more personal than you might think. During a Thursday morning interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer, Premier Doug Ford was asked how Canadians really felt about Donald Trump. Most politicians would have deflected, sugar-coated, or sidestepped. Not Ford. He didn't blink. "He's probably the most disliked politician in the world in Canada," Ford said. The words were sharp, precise, and they landed with force. But he didn't stop there. Ford made it personal, calling Trump's aggressive policies an attack on Canada's closest family member. That phrase hit home for millions of Canadians, who once saw the U.S. as a partner, not an enemy. It was more than just a jab. This was a rare moment when a world leader went off script and called out the U.S. president in front of a global audience. Ford wasn't speaking in careful diplomatic language. He was angry, frustrated, and unfiltered. And the most revealing part? He claimed that even top Republicans agree with him but are too scared to say it. "They totally disagree," he said. "But they're too scared to come out and say anything because the president will go after them." It wasn't just a comment, it was a warning. Ford had just peeled back the curtain on what many believe is a culture of fear in Washington. And he did it live, with the world watching. But that wasn't the whole story. Behind Ford's fiery words was a much bigger issue: money and power. At the start of the month, Trump quietly dropped a bombshell, a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods sold in the U.S. that weren't already covered by existing trade deals. For Canadian exporters, it felt like a slap in the face. For Ford, it was an outright declaration of war. This wasn't a slow buildup. It was sudden, aggressive, and brutal. Small businesses across Ontario and beyond were hit without warning. Lumber, auto parts, food products, prices soared overnight. And behind the scenes, panic set in. Ford didn't wait. He immediately called for a dollar-for-dollar retaliation, urging Canada to hit back just as hard. But here's where things got messy. Prime Minister Mark Carney refused. Instead of matching Trump's tariffs, Carney chose a quieter, more measured approach. No new countermeasures, no public confrontation, just silence. And that silence only made Ford louder. He called Trump's move an attack, said this wasn't going to be a church picnic, and made it crystal clear if the federal government wouldn't fight, he would. But what came next wasn't just political. It got deeply personal. Doug Ford wasn't just angry. He was done playing politics, standing in front of cameras. He looked like a man with nothing left to lose. His message, crystal clear: this guy's coming at us. Do you trust President Trump? I don't. It was the kind of blunt, unfiltered statement that rarely comes from a sitting Canadian officialist, especially when talking about the President of the United States. But Ford wasn't trying to be diplomatic. He was drawing a line in the sand. This wasn't just about tariffs anymore. It was about loyalty, power, and the question that Ford kept asking loudly was simple: how long will Canadians let themselves be pushed around by a man who only sees them as leverage? And he wasn't alone in that thinking. According to Ford, even top Republican lawmakers, governors, senators, and members of Congress privately disagree with Trump's behavior. But none of them have the courage to say it out loud. They're too scared, Ford said flatly, because the president will go after them. With those words, Ford wasn't just confronting Trump. He was exposing a culture of fear inside Washington, implying that Trump's influence isn't just dangerous abroad, it's toxic at home too. It was bold, risky, and completely off script. But while Ford raised his voice, Ottawa stayed silent. And that contrast between Ford's fire and Carney's calm was only going to get louder, because Ford wasn't done swinging yet as the U.S. cranked up the pressure. A different kind of battle was brewing, not across the border, but inside Canada's own government. Doug Ford was charging ahead like a battering ram, loud, aggressive, and unrelenting. But Prime Minister Mark Carney, he was playing a very different game. Carney refused to retaliate. No tariffs, no public challenge to Trump. While Ford was rallying for action, Carney was holding back, carefully measuring every move too. Ford, that wasn't strategy, it was surrender. He openly questioned Carney's leadership, criticizing the Prime Minister's refusal to act as weakness. To Ford's supporters, it looked like their premier was the only one willing to stand up to a bully, and to Carney's allies. Ford was seen as reckless, turning international diplomacy into a shouting match. But behind the scenes, the stakes were growing. Canadian businesses were in limbo, unsure whether to brace for a trade war or wait for a quiet resolution that might never come. Ford didn't seem interested in waiting. At every press conference, he doubled down, pressuring Carney to hit back. Harder, faster, louder. But Carney stayed silent, letting Ford dominate the headlines and the outrage. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was a power struggle unfolding in real time. Two men with wildly different visions of leadership, caught in a high-stakes game of political chess, and Ford, he was already making his next move. When diplomacy failed and the federal government stayed quiet, Doug Ford decided to fight another way, not with trade deals or tariffs, but with bold, symbolic gestures designed to send one very loud message. Canada was done being pushed around first. He took a direct shot at one of America's tech darlings, Elon Musk. Ford canceled a contract with Musk's Starlink, a move that sent shockwaves through business and political circles. It wasn't just about the contract. It was about targeting a company that symbolized U.S. innovation, dominance, and influence. And then came something even more unexpected. He pulled American alcohol off the shelves of Ontario's LCBO bourbon. Tennessee whiskey and other U.S. imports were suddenly nowhere to be found. To the average shopper, it might have seemed petty, but to Ford, it was war by branding. Every bottle pulled off the shelf was a statement. If you tax our goods, we'll cut into yours. It didn't change policy overnight, but it did grab headlines. Suddenly, Ford wasn't just the premier of Ontario, he was the face of Canadian resistance, and it worked. People started paying attention, not just in Canada, but in Washington too. But Ford wasn't done yet. He was about to raise the stakes, this time with something far more serious than whiskey and WI-5. If pulling U.S. whiskey from store shelves made headlines, what Ford did next shook the room. He threatened to hit the United States, where it really hurts energy, in a move no one saw coming. Ford floated the idea of cutting off electricity exports to key northern U.S. states like New York. Canada supplies massive amounts of power to those regions, and pulling the plug literally wouldn't just spark headlines. It would spark a crisis. For 24 hours, the threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. And it worked. Trump, who had mostly ignored Ford up until this point, finally took the bait. But his response was strange, part praise, part flex. He called Ford a strong man, almost as if complimenting his boldness. Before bragging that the threat had already been walked back, "We had a problem with Ontario," Trump said. "We let them know what we were going to be doing. They dropped it immediately." It sounded like Trump was claiming victory, but the reality was far more complicated. Ford did back down from the energy surcharge, but not without getting something in return. A meeting with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington, D.C. That single conversation gave Ford a direct line to the power players in Trump's inner circle. It was a tactical retreat, not a surrender, and even after dropping the threat, Ford made sure to leave the door open. He told reporters the idea was still on the table, a warning shot that could be fired again at any time. Trump may have won the round, but the fight? Far from over. Ford may have stood the energy threat down, but if anyone thought that meant he was backing off for good, they weren't paying attention, because even after the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines cooled, Ford kept repeating one phrase: "It's still on the table." Those 5 words became a quiet warning, a pressure point, a way to remind both Trump and Washington that Canada still had leverage, and Ford knew exactly how to use it. By leaving the electricity threat hanging, Ford didn't just preserve a bargaining chip, he created suspense. Would Ontario really cut power to us states? Would Canada finally strike back? Or was it all a bluff? That uncertainty gave Ford something more powerful than tariffs or trade deals: control over the conversation. Every time Trump ramped up the pressure, reporters asked the same question: is Ford going to bring the energy charge back? And that's exactly what he wanted. Even without pulling the trigger, Ford had made himself impossible to ignore. He wasn't just reacting to Trump, he was outmaneuvering him in the one arena Trump values most, the spotlight. But while Ford stirred speculation, Trump turned to a different strategy: total silence. And that silence, it spoke volumes. After all the jabs, the tariffs, the threats, and the headline went quiet, no more press conferences, no fiery tweets, no direct shots at Doug Ford. It was almost as if the U.S. president had decided Ford wasn't worth responding to. Maybe it was strategy, maybe it was ego, or maybe Trump thought silence would sting more than words ever could. But if Trump thought ignoring Ford would make him stop, he was wrong. Ford kept swinging. He doubled down on every comment, kept calling out Trump by name, took every opportunity to frame the president as a global outcast, probably the most disliked politician in the world. And every time Ford went public, the media followed. Trump might have been silent, but Ford had already found a new audience: the people. Canadians began to see him not just as a premier, but as a fighter, someone willing to speak plainly when others stayed quiet. Even critics couldn't deny it. Ford wasn't afraid to step into the ring, and in a political world dominated by power, ego, and unpredictabilities, sometimes just refusing to back down is enough to change the game. Because while Trump might have brushed him off, Doug Ford had already reshaped the narrative, and whether anyone likes it or not, he's not done yet. What started as a simple trade dispute has spiraled into one of the most unexpected political feuds in recent memory. Doug Ford, once seen as a local Canadian premier, has transformed into a loud, unfiltered voice on the global stage, openly challenging a U.S. president who's not exactly known for backing down. From calling Trump the most disliked politician in the world, to threatening to cut off electricity to American states, to pulling U.S. products from Canadian shelves. Ford has shown he's willing to fight fire with fire, even if it means standing alone. And yet, for all the noise, one thing remains unclear. Has any of it worked? Trump hasn't blinked, the tariffs are still in place, and Canada's federal leadership remains cautious, refusing to escalate. So where does that leave Ford? Some see him as reckless, others as brave. But one thing is certain: he's shifted the tone. He's pulled back the curtain on the quiet resentment building between two close allies, and he's forced a question into the spotlight. What happens when a smaller nation decides it's done playing nice with a superpower? Because this isn't just about politics anymore, it's about pride, power, and the uncomfortable truth that even among allies, things can turn hostile fast.